It started like any other episode. Joe was sitting across from a guest, coffee in hand, microphones live, the familiar hum of the studio filling the background. They had been talking for almost an hour, drifting from science to philosophy, from the human brain to the meaning of life. It was the kind of conversation Joe loved, the kind where you forget there's an audience and you're just chasing truth. And then it happened. The guest leaned forward, almost lowering his voice. He said, "There's a line from the Quran I think you should hear." Joe, curious but casual, nodded. He'd heard quotes from all kinds of religious texts before, from the Bible, from Buddhist teachings, from Stoic philosophy. But this one felt different even before it was spoken. The guest's tone changed. It was as if he was no longer just sharing information. He was delivering something sacred. And then he said it. One short verse, a handful of words. And yet as they echoed in the studio, the energy shifted. Joe didn't say anything at first. He just sat there. The words seemed to linger in the air like they were meant to be absorbed, not just heard. Something about them was clean, pure in a way that stripped away all the noise of modern life. No exaggeration, no poetic flourish, just truth, plain and undeniable. He found himself repeating it in his head, trying to unpack why it hit so hard. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't wrapped in metaphor, but there was weight in it, the kind of weight you feel when you realize someone just pulled the curtain back on how life really works. "Man," Joe finally said, almost under his breath, "that's heavy." The guest smiled, but not in a way that felt smug. It was the kind of smile you give when you've seen someone touch something profound for the first time. And Joe, the guy who had sat across from Navy SEALs, astronauts, scientists, and spiritual leaders, was suddenly quiet. For a moment, the usual rhythm of the podcast, the banter, the jokes, the curious back and forth was gone. Instead, there was this pause, an unspoken agreement that whatever had just been said wasn't something you could rush past. Later, Joe would explain that it wasn't about religion in the traditional sense. It wasn't about converting or believing or taking sides. It was about how sometimes in the middle of your day you can hear a single sentence that forces you to reevaluate everything. He remembered his first thought. How old is this? When the guest told him it was over 1,400 years old, Joe shook his head. How could something written so long ago feel like it was speaking directly to the modern human condition, to the anxiety, the chaos, the constant distraction of life in 20? It was the kind of clarity you don't get from scrolling social media, or watching the news, or even reading most self-help books. It cut deeper, not into what you wanted to hear, but into what you needed to hear. Joe leaned back in his chair, still processing. This was the guy who'd heard near-death experiences, ayahuasca revelations, military survival stories, and yet a single verse from the Quran had him searching for the right words. He asked his guest to repeat it, not because he hadn't heard it the first time, but because he wanted to feel it again. And when the words came for the second time, they landed even heavier. It was like hearing a piece of music you didn't fully understand the first time, but now every note hit perfectly. Joe asked, "What does it mean? Like really mean?" And that's when the conversation began to open up. The guest explained not just the translation, but the context, where in the Quran it came from, who it was first spoken to, and why it mattered then, and still matters now. As the explanation unfolded, Joe kept coming back to one point. How is it that people don't know this? How is it that I've gone my whole life without hearing this exact sentence? The guest's answer was simple. People are often looking for truth in places where the truth is already waiting for them. Joe nodded slowly. He knew exactly what that meant. How many times had he gone on long, winding explorations for meaning, through books, conversations, and psychedelic journeys, only to realize that sometimes truth is sitting quietly in a book most people never bother to open? The more Joe thought about it, the more he realized that this moment was different from any deep conversation he'd had before. This wasn't just a mental puzzle to solve. It wasn't an idea to debate. It was a mirror. And in that mirror, he saw the same thing billions of humans had seen for centuries, a reminder of what really matters. Not in a vague, inspirational way, but in a way that made you suddenly aware of your life, your actions, your purpose. The cameras were rolling. Millions of listeners would eventually hear this episode, but in that moment, Joe wasn't thinking about the audience. He wasn't thinking about going viral. He wasn't thinking about content. He was just sitting there feeling the gravity of a verse that had traveled across centuries, cultures, and languages to land right there, in his studio, on an ordinary afternoon. And that was the start of a conversation that would take him and everyone listening far beyond the walls of that room into questions that had no easy answers. It was a moment where curiosity became awe, and awe became the need to understand. Because once you've heard something like that, you can't unhear it, and you don't want to. Joe leaned in. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was something deeper, the kind of leaning in you do when you feel like you're about to be let in on a secret that changes the way you see the world. The guest took a slow breath before speaking, and then he recited the verse. It was simple, elegant, no unnecessary complexity, no layered metaphors that needed untangling, just a truth, spoken as plainly as the rising sun. Indeed, to Allah we belong, and to Him we shall return. 7 words in English, but when spoken in the original Arabic, they carried a rhythm, a cadence, that made the meaning sink in differently, not just as a statement, but as a reality. Joe's eyes flickered. You could see his brain immediately start turning over the words. It was a rare moment where he didn't respond with another question right away.
Instead, he let the silence breathe. "Wow," he finally said. That's intense." The guest nodded. "It's a reminder," he said, "that everything we have, everything we think we own, even our own lives, isn't really ours. We're on loan, and one day we return to the one who gave it all to us." Joe rubbed his chin. "So it's like saying we're not in control, but also that there's a bigger picture." "Exactly," the guest replied. "It's not meant to make you feel powerless. It's meant to make you feel aware of your place in the grand scheme of things." The narrator's voice could almost step in here for the audience, explaining that this verse comes from Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 156 of the Quran. It's recited by Muslims when they face loss, tragedy, or hardship, not as a resignation but as a grounding truth. Joe's expression shifted. "So people actually say this when something bad happens?" "They do," the guest said. "If someone dies, if there's an accident, if life takes an unexpected turn. This verse is a way of anchoring yourself. It's a reminder that life is temporary, that nothing you lose here is really lost forever, because we all return to the same source." For a moment, Joe was quiet again. You could almost see him replaying events from his own life, friends who'd passed away, moments when things had slipped out of his control, times when he'd wrestled with the randomness of life. This verse, it didn't pretend the pain wasn't real. It didn't say don't feel sad. It simply reframed the sadness into something bigger than the moment. Joe finally broke the silence. "That's honestly beautiful." The guest smiled again, this time softer. "It's why it's so powerful. Whether you're Muslim or not, whether you believe in God or not, the idea is the same. You didn't make yourself. You don't own yourself. You're part of something much greater than you, and one day you go back to it." The narrator could feel the audience leaning forward now, just like Joe had in the studio, because in a world obsessed with ownership, my car, my house, my body, my time, here was a verse that stripped all of that away and said no, none of this is truly yours. Joe shifted in his chair. "You know what's crazy?" he said. "That verse is like the exact opposite of how we're taught to think in the modern world. Everything now is about me, my goals, my happiness, my freedom, and then this comes along and just flips it." The guest nodded. "That's why it hits so hard. It's not just a religious statement, it's a correction, a course adjustment. It reminds you that the universe doesn't revolve around you, and that's actually freeing." Joe laughed lightly. "Freeing or terrifying, depending on how you look at it." "True," the guest admitted, "but think about it. If you really believed this, then you'd stop clinging so tightly to things. You'd stop losing yourself over losses. You'd start focusing on living in a way that matters, because you know you're going to give this life back one day." The verse wasn't long. It didn't take 5 minutes to read, or require a deep dive into ancient commentary to feel its weight. It was one of those truths you can carry in your pocket for the rest of your life. Joe leaned back. "Man, I get it now, why people remember this one." And that was the moment the conversation began to shift from curiosity to transformation, because once you know the verse, you start to see the world differently. Every relationship, every possession, every plan you make, you start realizing it's all part of a journey with a clear beginning and a certain end. The guest explained how the verse ties into a bigger theme in the Quran, that life is a trust, your body is a trust, your time is a trust, your wealth, your talents, your opportunities, all given to you for a while to see how you use them, and one day, the trust is returned. Joe tapped the table lightly. That's one of the most grounding things I've heard in a long time." The cameras kept rolling, but something had shifted. You could feel it in the air. The verse had done its work, not by persuading, not by debating, but by simply existing. And for Joe, it wasn't about agreeing or disagreeing. It was about realizing that there are sentences in this world that can cut through all the noise, all the distractions, all the doubts, and land right where they're meant to. Sentences like this one. A verse that has traveled across 14 centuries, through deserts and cities, whispered in grief and shouted in faith, now landing here in a modern podcast studio in front of millions who might be hearing it for the first time. And that's where the real conversation began. Not about whether the verse was true in an abstract sense, but about what it meant for how we live, how we love, and how we face the inevitable return. Joe sat forward, elbows resting on the table, his eyes locked on the guest. "All right," he said, "break it down for me. What's really going on in that verse? Because it feels bigger than just a spiritual saying." The guest smiled knowingly. "It is bigger," he replied. "It's not just about belief in God. It's about perspective, a perspective that changes how you see every part of your life." He leaned slightly toward the microphone. "When it says indeed to Allah we belong, the first part is about identity. It's reminding you that you didn't create yourself. You didn't choose your birth, your body, your DNA, the era you live in. All of it was given to you. That's a humbling thought. It means your existence is not an accident, but it's also not something you fully own. You're here on purpose." Joe tilted his head. "So like, even your own life isn't really yours." "That's right," the guest said. "It's entrusted to you. You can shape it, you can influence it, you can live it well, but at the end of the day, you're a caretaker of something that belongs to someone else." Joe nodded slowly, rubbing his chin. "That's wild. It's like the opposite of the whole self-made man thing." The guest chuckled softly. "Exactly. The verse shifts you away from thinking you're the ultimate authority. And here's the thing, most people walk around carrying enormous stress because they believe everything rests on them. This verse says, no, you're part of a bigger story. You're a character in a book that's already been written. The narrator's voice could almost step in here, explaining how in Islamic thought, this sense of belonging is a source of both peace and responsibility. Peace, because you know you're not adrift in a random universe. Responsibility, because the life you've been given is a trust you'll be accountable for. Joe glanced down for a moment, then back up. And the second part, and to him we shall return. That's about death, right? Yes, but not in the way people usually think about it, the guest said. In the Quran, returning to God isn't painted as an end, it's a homecoming. Think about it. If you truly believe your soul came from somewhere before this life, then death is just the return trip. You're going back to the source. That changes how you think about fear, loss, and even ambition. Joe raised his eyebrows. So it's not like doom and gloom. It's more like inevitability. Exactly, the guest replied. You're reminded that life here is temporary, not in a depressing way, but in a way that makes every moment count. It's like knowing the clock is ticking during a game. You don't waste time on the meaningless plays. Joe let out a quiet laugh. That's actually motivating. The guest leaned back slightly. It is, because if you know you're returning, you start asking different questions. What am I doing with the time I've been given? How am I treating people? What am I leaving behind? The narrator could bridge this thought for the audience. Imagine how much lighter life would feel if you stopped clinging so tightly to what you can't keep. Money, status, even your own body. Imagine if instead of obsessing over what's yours, you started seeing it all as borrowed and trusted for a short while. Joe was quiet for a beat, and then he said, you know, it's crazy. I've had all these conversations about mindfulness, stoicism, even psychedelic trips where people talk about losing their ego. But this verse, it's basically the same idea, except it's been here for over 1,000 years. The guest nodded. And it's universal. You don't have to be Muslim to understand it. Anyone can feel the truth in the idea that life is temporary, and that we're part of something greater than ourselves. The difference is, in Islam, this truth comes with a direct connection to the one who gave you life in the first place. Joe thought about that. So it's like, instead of just letting go into nothingness, you're letting go into someone. Yes, the guest said, into the one who knows you better than you know yourself. The narrator's tone could deepen here, pulling the audience in. When you carry this verse in your heart, you live differently. You stop pretending you're immortal. You stop treating people as disposable. You stop hoarding your time for selfish pursuits. Because you know every word, every action, every decision is part of the trust you'll one day return. Joe broke into a slight smile. Man, that's a hell of a perspective shift. I mean, think about how different the world would be if people actually lived like that. You wouldn't get caught up in petty drama. You wouldn't waste years chasing something empty. You'd just focus on what matters. The guest pointed at him. And that's why this verse is so short. It's meant to be carried with you, repeated in moments of clarity or crisis. It's like an anchor. Every time you start drifting into pride, greed, or despair, it pulls you back to center. Joe took a deep breath and exhaled. Yeah, I get it now. It's not just about religion. It's about a mindset. And that mindset is freeing. The conversation lingered there for a moment. No rush to move on. Because some truths, once spoken, deserve space. The verse had been broken down. The words had been unpacked. And yet there was still something about it that went beyond explanation. Something you could only feel. The narrator could close this section with a reflection for the viewer. Maybe that's the real power of these words. They don't just inform you. They transform you. They don't just tell you about life and death. They reframe your entire relationship with both. And once you've heard them, you can't see the world the same way again. Joe leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly, like a man who'd just been handed a puzzle piece to a much bigger picture. All right, he said. So now I've got to ask, why does it hit so hard? Why does it make your chest feel heavy, but in a good way? The guest smiled knowingly. That, he said, is the part you don't just hear, you feel. And it's the reason people have carried this verse for over 14 centuries. Joe paused, his voice dropping just a little. You know, there's something about that verse that hits different when you actually think about it, not just hear it. The guest nodded slowly. It's because it touches on the most raw, vulnerable part of being human. Joe looked up, searching for words. I mean, nobody really wants to think about death, or the fact that we don't really own our lives. It's scary, right? Exactly, the guest said softly. But that's the point. The verse doesn't shy away from that fear. It brings it front and center. The narrator's voice stepped in, calm, empathetic, yet powerful. Death is the great equalizer. It's the one certainty that no amount of wealth, fame, or power can change. Yet for most people, death is a topic to avoid, a door to keep closed. This verse throws that door wide open. To him we shall return. It reminds us that every heartbeat is borrowed time, that the plans we make, the dreams we chase, the grudges we hold, all of it is fleeting. And yet, in acknowledging this, there is profound freedom. Joe exhaled, the sound heavy but reflective. So maybe that's why it feels so heavy, but in a good way. It's like a weight that grounds you. The guest smiled gently. It's a weight that balances you. It's the awareness that life isn't endless, but it's meaningful because of that. It forces you to ask, what am I really here for? Joe leaned forward again, eyes bright. And that's the thing. Once you accept that you're going back to the source, everything changes. You start caring less about the small stuff. You stop sweating the petty stuff.
you focus on what really lasts. The narrator could elaborate. This verse speaks to the deep human craving for meaning. It's not enough to just exist. We want purpose, direction, something that outlives us. Knowing that life is temporary, and that we return to a source beyond ourselves, invites us to live with intention. Joe nodded slowly. I've talked to people who've had near-death experiences. They say the same thing, that suddenly all the things that seemed so important before don't matter anymore.
Exactly, the guest agreed. And the verse echoes that reality every day for millions of people around the world. It's a reminder in moments of joy and sorrow that life is a trust and death is a return. Joe's voice softened, and that's beautiful, right? To think of death not as an end, but as a homecoming. The narrator could guide the viewer to reflect deeply. Imagine living your life with this verse as your compass. When you face loss, instead of despair, you feel connection. When you face success, instead of pride, you feel gratitude. When you face challenges, instead of defeat, you find strength. Joe's tone became almost reverent. It's like the verse reaches inside and shakes you awake, wakes you up to what's real. The guest nodded. And that awakening is why this verse has survived through centuries of hardship, war, and change, because it speaks to something universal, the undeniable truth of our existence. Joe smiled faintly. You know, I've always been fascinated by how ancient wisdom keeps popping up in different cultures. Stoicism, Buddhism, even Native American teachings, they all touch on this idea of impermanence and returning to something bigger. The guest agreed. Yes, but what makes this verse stand out is its simplicity and directness. No frills, no complicated rituals, just a clear statement about life and death. Joe nodded, eyes intense, and it's not depressing, it's hopeful, because it says, hey, this isn't the end, there's something beyond. The narrator's voice could deepen here to close the section. In that hope lies the power to live fully, to love fiercely, to forgive freely, to embrace the unknown with courage. Joe leaned back, the weight of the conversation settling like a warm blanket. This verse, it's more than words. It's a guide, a call to live awake, to live aware. The guest smiled warmly, and once you hear it, you carry it with you, in your mind, in your heart, in your actions. The room fell silent for a moment. The verse had done its work, touching the core of what it means to be human. And for Joe, it was clear. This wasn't just theology, it was life. Joe looked directly into the camera, his voice steady but warm. You know, after all these years of talking to some of the most interesting minds on the planet, hearing this verse from the Quran, indeed to Allah we belong, and to Him we shall return, it hit me in a way nothing else has. He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. This isn't about religion or politics. It's about something deeper, something that connects all of us, whether we call it God, the universe, or simply the mystery of life. Joe leaned forward, eyes thoughtful. It's about realizing that none of us are here by accident, that our time on this planet, however long or short, is a gift, and that one day we all return to whatever gave us life in the first place. The guest nodded, smiling gently. That's exactly it. This verse reminds us that life is a trust, and how we choose to live, with kindness, courage, humility, matters more than anything else. Joe shook his head slowly. It's funny. For so long I thought being strong meant controlling everything, making all the right moves, never showing weakness. But this verse, it taught me strength means knowing your limits, knowing that some things aren't in your hands, and still choosing to live fully anyway. The narrator's voice softened, inviting viewers in. What if we all lived with this awareness? What if we remembered that life is temporary and precious? What if we stopped chasing distractions and started chasing purpose? Joe smiled, a mix of awe and gratitude in his eyes. Maybe that's the most powerful lesson I've ever heard, that no matter where you come from, what you believe, or what you've been through, we all belong to something bigger, and that knowing can change everything. The guest added quietly, it's an invitation to look deeper, to explore, and to find your own meaning in these words. Joe nodded, and I think that's what makes this verse so timeless. It's not about answers, it's about questions. Questions that push us to be better, to live with intention, and to face life's challenges with grace. The narrator closed with a gentle challenge. If you've heard this verse for the first time today, don't just let it float away like a passing thought. Hold it close, let it sit with you. See what changes when you carry it in your heart. Joe's voice softened, almost a whisper. Because at the end of the day, that's the real power of this lesson. It's not just words on a page. It's a call to live awake, to live aware, to live like you know you belong, and that one day you'll return. The screen fades slowly as Joe's last words linger. To all of us on this journey, may we live with courage, with kindness, and with the wisdom to see the bigger picture.